So we're here with Phaidra, who is a former news editor of the Spark, but she's giving her own personal opinions about all these things. And do you think in general the media deliberately tries to influence people's attitudes or just presents truth and entertainment as they find it?
I think it depends on what outlet you're looking at. And I think when I was at the Spark, what was beneficial was the fact that we could generally, we would be able to just report the story. Mainly because there wasn't an idea necessarily of profit, whereas I think with some outlets there's more clickbait kind of journalism, which doesn't necessarily detract from the journalism that they do, but I think there's also a difference between, say, newspapers that rely on having to pay for the newspaper and adverts and that kind of thing compared to, say, the BBC, who don't have that funding in the same way, and so can be, let's say, less dramatic about their about their pieces. Yeah.
Okay. How aware are people of the sources that shape their opinions? So are your audiences, or were your audiences, critical thinking skills quite good enough? Or I know it's a uni newspaper.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think we definitely did have a lot of constructive critical thinking in the responses that we got from the newspaper, which was always helpful as a journalist. Like, I'm not doing a journalism degree, so I was kind of learning on the go. But I think that people are aware of where their newspaper or social media or however they're getting their news is coming from. But also, we were in a situation where the audience is the university, and usually people who are at university level have quite good critical thinking skills, so it's a slightly different audience than, say, if you were a general newspaper or news outlet.
But for like a uni newspaper, do you think when people are actually reading it that they might just be reading it rather than as a uni student, just someone reading it whilst like in their spare time or something?
I think people who read the Spark tend to be invested in the news that we're giving because it tends to be about the campus, so they're more likely to be critical of what's being reported because it affects their day-to-day life and it's the kind of thing that they're involved in, so they're more likely to be invested in how that is portrayed in the newspaper. So you always have to be kind of aware of that these are day-to-day lives of people at the university, so when you're reporting it, you need to be kind of aware of that.
It's almost like BBC South today.
Yeah, that was kind of the next question actually, is about when you're choosing articles to write, would you be focusing on just on the events, or actually thinking about how people may think about this and what the kind of impact is?
It's a little bit of both. It depends on what the event was. So let's say there was a climate change talk and someone wanted to report on that. That would be more reporting the facts because it was an interesting event, but it wasn't necessarily something that people would get divisive about, if you see what I mean. Whereas, say, for example, when the strikes were on, you kind of had to be aware of how that was being reported because it was such a divisive thing within the university between those who supported the strikes and those who didn't. So you kind of had to be as unbiased as possible during that.
Okay, that's fair. Kind of a bit different, but
Sorry.
No, I mean this is.
Oh, okay.
So does social media make audiences less passive? So sharing opinions and posts, are audiences now dictating their attitudes to the media first?
I think it definitely creates much more interaction between what you're seeing and what you're actually understanding. So you can do research behind stories, which I've definitely done before, where someone will share a link and I'll be like, I don't believe that, and I'll Google it and I'll see how it's necessary. It may still be true, but the facts may be presented in a different way. So I think that's quite interesting with social media. And also you get to see the kind of points of view that people you know have, which is quite interesting, that I don't think you would necessarily get if you just kind of knew them on a one-to-one basis. I think what people share on social media and the news that they believe and share and support says a lot about those people.
So in terms of like Spark then, I guess it's what you're saying, I guess it's the other way around then. You're actually looking into being critical about what people are like in the public or the students are actually saying, rather than them being critical about what you're saying?
I think people were critical about what we said, but I think also what we did try, the structure I tried to get with my writers was that every time you wrote an article there had to be a quote from a student in it. Even if it was just your mate, there had to be some sort of outside source giving an opinion, preferably an opinion from both sides of the story, which I think was good because then we could try and be more unbiased because, as I said before, we weren't necessarily trying to sell, we're trying to get people to pick up the paper, obviously, but we aren't relying on sales or ads in that regard. But yeah, I just felt like there was slightly less pressure to give a certain story, and it was more about giving the events as they happened. But I think that's a very privileged position that we were in, which I don't think other newsletters necessarily have, but then again, I don't do a journalism degree, so...
Yeah, that's fair, neither do we.
Continuing the social media idea, and also just the internet in general, do you think it enables people to shape their own influences in a way that wasn't previously possible? Because in the past you just had the TV news that showed the news that they chose, and newspapers had their agenda, whereas now you can go anywhere and sort of find your own sources in a way.
I think there's always going to be an agenda. Well, not even an agenda, just there's always going to be different opinions. Even with the internet, it just so happens that everyone can share their different opinions. Because of the way that the internet is, you'll find someone who can agree with you, basically. And so I think regardless of what news outlet you support, you will be able to find one that agrees with you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think especially with the internet, you can almost make your own echo chamber where you only look at things that agree with you.
I think that's quite interesting. Again, I don't know anything about the way this works, but I know that algorithms in social media it will come up with ads and stuff, or pages that are recommended to you that are within your own things that you've already liked, things that you have shown a pattern of liking. And I think that targeted social media, like that targeted way that you experience social media, will be very different to the way I experience social media, to the point that you can almost create your own little bubble or echo chamber within social media, which I think causes even more divisiveness when you see people you know sharing stuff that you wouldn't necessarily agree with.
That's a pretty good point, actually, because it's almost like, again, when you talk about the media shaping people's opinions, they are literally shaping your attitudes because they are physically telling you more about what you want to hear. Yeah, and
you've kind of got almost like a profile built where you can't necessarily perceive, but it's been built around things that, like, say, you've liked, and then it's...
Exactly, and it's like with, say, Brexit.
Everything comes down to Brexit.
Everything comes down to Brexit. I think that I was very much... So I couldn't vote, I was two weeks too young, but I very much was set on the idea that, of course we're going to stay. Of course we're going to stay, because that was what was coming up on my social media. And I think that the fact that... I think it was a big shock for me and a lot of other people that we did leave, because I just wasn't seeing that side of the argument, because my social media, which is where I get most of my news from, was saying that we were going to remain, if that makes sense. But that's just personal.
Definitely,
Total sense.
Yeah.
So, kind of going on to the next thing.
Yeah, go for it, sorry.
So, lastly, has the media become more extreme and more divisive in recent years? So, more partisan in reporting and more violence in TVs and films and all that sort of thing?
I don't think it's necessarily become more divisive. I think there was always this divisiveness, it wasn't as accessible. I think a couple of decades ago, there's no way I could have been able to find out what a Republican in America was thinking of the British politics without seeing it on the newspaper or on TV. But now I've got a friend in America, I can be like, hey, what do your Republican friends think of this? And like that kind of, or I could even just search up Republican views on whatever. Like there's a lot more connectedness, but I think that divisiveness was always there. It just has become more, it has a platform now.
It's more obvious.
Yeah, it's more obvious. Violence, I talk a lot about violence in my degree. I do English literature. Like, there's a lot of... I think there's always been extreme forms of violence. I mean, like, especially in the latter half of the 20th century. I think we've had wars and stuff. I think violence has always been there. It's just it wasn't necessarily, you could avoid it a lot more as part of your entertainment. If you didn't want to see that film, you just wouldn't see it. Whereas now, it would come up as an advert on your Facebook, or as someone would tweet about it. And even if you haven't necessarily seen that film, it will still come up, and you can't necessarily avoid it. And I think violence is used a lot in media nowadays, but I don't just think it's just an escalation from what's happened previously. Man has always been violent and had that capacity for violence. It's just now it's been put on a larger scale.
It's been commercialised.
Commercialised, yes.
Yeah.
But I think it hasn't recently happened. I think that's happened in the last 50 years or so.
Especially things like video games that focus a lot on like shooting other people. Seems to be
I think
a selling point.
But then again, like, you would have shooting ranges at fairs and stuff like that. I think it's just an escalation from that to today's modern world. I don't think that it's suddenly gone from no violence to violence. I think it's just escalated slightly, but then it's been transferred to the modern day.
And I guess as well as people more like see it if you're at a fair and there's a shooting range, you kind of got to be at the fair to see it. But it's like you were saying earlier about how I've seen the stuff on adverts and like billboards and all that sort of thing. It's kind of harder to. Would you say it's harder to avoid now than it was quite a while ago?
I think it's harder to avoid, but I think it's still possible to avoid. I think, again, those algorithms can work in your favour in that regard. You can, if you don't want to see a certain violent thing, you can say hide this and it won't show something like that again. But I think at the end of the day, it does depend on the people you have on your social media as well, because they will share that kind of thing and you can, again, have some control over that. I don't think we're at a stage yet where you can't avoid it, but I think, it is very much still pervasive in everyday society.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. So.
Okay, well that was all of our questions. That seems a nice point to finish on, so thank you very much.
Thanks.